Arthur told me you would come." The old man stood beside a battered pickup at the mountain overlook, staring at me as if he had been waiting for years. I had never seen him before, yet he knew my grandfather's name. And somehow that scared me, more than the inheritance hearing that had happened that morning. "My name is Ethan Carter," and by noon, everyone in my family believed I had been given the worst inheritance of all. My billionaire grandfather had left millions to almost everyone. My father received a substantial investment portfolio. My older brother Daniel received several properties and a generous trust. My cousins received stock cash and pieces of businesses they had never worked for. Then the estate attorney looked down at his papers and said, "My name. Ethan Carter is to receive the 2012 Ford Explorer currently registered in the estate." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then my brother laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a real laugh. My father smiled too. The kind of smile a man wears when something has gone exactly the way he expected. Daniel leaned toward me. "Seriously?" I looked at the attorney. "That's it." The attorney nodded. "The vehicle is yours free and clear." I looked around the conference room. Nobody seemed shocked. They looked relieved, amused, or quietly satisfied. For a moment, I wondered whether I had somehow misunderstood the entire will. My father cleared his throat. "Your grandfather always had an unusual sense of humor." A few relatives chuckled. I didn't. I simply reached for the keys. That was when Daniel laughed again. "You got a used car while the rest of us got millions." I looked at him. I guess Grandpa knew what he was doing. The room went quiet. Daniel's smile disappeared for half a second. Then my father patted my shoulder. "Don't take it personally, Ethan." I didn't answer. The estate attorney handed me a folder containing the title and registration. Before I left, he added something that made me pause. "There is one more instruction concerning the vehicle." I turned around. "What kind your grandfather specifically ordered that nothing inside the vehicle be removed before you received it?" I frowned. "Nothing. Nothing." My father suddenly looked interested. "Arthur put instructions about a car." The attorney nodded. "Yes." My father's expression changed so quickly that I almost missed it. Almost. I drove the Explorer home that afternoon. It was old, but not falling apart. The seats were worn. There was a faded coffee stain near the center console, and a cracked plastic cup holder. It smelled faintly of leather dust, and the pene-scented air freshener people used when they were trying to make an old car feel newer than it was. I opened the glove compartment, insurance papers, an owner's manual, a tire pressure gauge, nothing. I checked beneath the seats, nothing. I was about to close the driver's door when I noticed the GPS. It was an older built-in navigation system. I turned it on. There was only one saved destination, home. I stared at the screen. Home. I assumed the previous owner had forgotten to erase it, but then I remembered the attorney's warning. Nothing inside the vehicle was supposed to be removed. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed the destination. The route appeared. It was a long drive west away from the city and toward the Appalachian foothills. I almost turned it off. Instead, I started the engine. For the next 3 hours, I drove through familiar American highways and then increasingly quiet roads. The suburbs gave way to farmland. Gas stations became fewer. Cell service weakened. I kept thinking about the inheritance hearing, about Daniel laughing, about my father smiling, and about the strange look on his face when the attorney mentioned the car. As evening approached, the GPS directed me onto a narrow mountain road. I followed it until the pavement ended at a gravel overlook. There were no houses nearby, no businesses, just trees, mountains, and a wide view of the valley below. I turned off the engine, then I saw him. An elderly man stood beside an old pickup truck near the railing. He was wearing a faded denim jacket and work boots. He looked at my Explorer, then at me. He didn't seem surprised. He walked slowly toward my driver's window. I lowered it. "Can I help you?" He studied my face. "You're Ethan." My stomach tightened. "How do you know my name?" He didn't answer as immediately. Instead, he looked toward the passenger seat. "Did Arthur leave you the car?" I nodded. The old man exhaled, then he kept his promise. I stepped out. "Who are you?" "My name is Samuel Reed." He held out his hand. I shook it. His grip was stronger than I expected. "Your grandfather told me something," he said. "What?" Samuel looked directly into my eyes. "He told me that if you ever came here, you would probably be angry." I almost laughed. Angry at your family, at him, maybe even at yourself. I looked back at the explorer. You know what happened today? I know exactly what happened. My throat tightened. Then tell me why he gave me a used car. Samuel glanced toward the mountains. Because the car isn't what he left you. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small brass key. I stared at it. What does that open? Samuel closed his fingers around the key. That's what you're going to find out. He looked at me for another moment. But before you do, Ethan, you need to understand something. What? Your grandfather didn't trust the people who inherited his money. I felt a chill move through me. Then who did he trust? Samuel looked at me. You. For the first time that day, I had no answer. And somewhere beneath the floor of that old SUV, I suddenly realized there might be a reason my grandfather had made sure I received nothing that looked valuable. I just didn't know how much it was going to cost me to learn why. Samuel didn't hand me the brass key. He simply held it between us, letting me look at it. Why would my grandpa leave something like this in a car? I asked. Because he didn't want anyone else finding it. Who? Samuel looked toward the road behind me. Your father. That answer landed harder than I expected. I had spent my entire life trying to understand why my father treated me differently from my brother. Robert Carter had never been openly cruel. That would have been easier. Instead, he had been polite, controlled, distant. Whenever Daniel succeeded, Dad celebrated. Whenever I succeeded, Dad nodded and changed the subject. I had stopped expecting his approval years ago. But hearing Samuel say his name at that mountain overlook made all those old moments suddenly feel different. Why wouldn't Grandpa trust my father? Samuel finally placed the brass key in my palm. Because Arthur knew your father better than you did. I closed my fingers around it. Then tell me what happened. Samuel shook his head. Not here. He pointed toward the Explorer. There's something inside that car you need to see first. We walked back to the vehicle. Samuel opened the rear hatch and knelt beside the cargo floor. He ran his fingers along the edge of the carpet. There. I looked closely. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed a tiny metal latch hidden beneath the carpet. I pulled it. The floor lifted. Underneath was a shallow compartment. Inside sat a small black metal box. I stared at it. How did you know that was there? Because I helped your grandfather put it there. My heart started beating faster. The brass key fit the lock perfectly. Inside were 4 things. An old photograph, a folded property deed, a handwritten letter, and a small envelope with my name on it. Ethan. My hand suddenly felt unsteady. I picked up the photograph first. It showed my grandfather as a much younger man standing beside Samuel, in front of what looked like an unfinished construction site. Arthur was smiling. Samuel wasn't. On the back, someone had written a date from more than 30 years earlier. I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Arthur's. Ethan, if you're reading, then you probably believe I left you almost nothing. I stopped. Samuel watched me quietly. I continued. That is exactly what I wanted you to believe. I swallowed. My grandfather explained that he had spent his final years watching his family change. As his fortune grew, people who had once visited him because they loved him began visiting because they wanted something. He wrote that he wasn't disappointed by the money itself. He was disappointed by what money revealed. Then came the sentence that made me sit down on the tailgate. I have reason to believe that someone close to me has been moving money out of the company without my permission. I looked at Samuel. He nodded. Keep reading. Arthur wrote that he had hired private investigators and forensic accountants without telling the family. The investigation had uncovered suspicious payments made through consulting companies. Millions of dollars had disappeared over several years. The names weren't directly connected to the family, but the people receiving the money were. I felt my stomach tighten. Does this involve my father? Samuel didn't answer. I looked back at the letter. Arthur wrote that he had deliberately kept Ethan away from the family business because he believed Ethan was the only person who hadn't become dependent on the family fortune. Your father believes money is power. Your brother believes money is proof that he matters. I want you to understand that money is only a tool. I stared at those words for a long moment. Then I reached for the envelope. Inside was another note. This one was shorter. Do not confront your father. Do not tell Daniel what you found. Take the deed to my attorney, then ask him about the Carter Family Trust. I looked up. What's the Carter Family Trust? Samuel sighed. Something your grandfather created before he died. Why didn't anyone mention it today? Because they don't know everything. That surprised me. You're telling me my family just divided millions of dollars. And there's another trust nobody knows about. Your grandfather planned it that way. I looked at the property deed. The name on it wasn't a person. It was a mountain property, the same area where we were standing. Why does he own this place? Samuel smiled faintly. He didn't. I looked at him. What? He bought the land decades ago. Then he transferred it to who? To a trust. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a puzzle where every answer created 3 more questions. Samuel finally told me the story. 35 years earlier, Arthur had been struggling to keep his small construction company alive. Banks wouldn't lend him enough money. Investors wanted control. Samuel had taken a chance on him. They made an agreement at that very overlook. Samuel would help Arthur secure his first major contract. Arthur promised that if the company ever became successful, he would never forget the people who helped him build it. He kept that promise, Samuel said. Then why involve me? Because your grandfather knew the company had become something he no longer recognized. I thought about the inheritance hearing. Millions distributed to people who barely understood how the company had been built, and me a used SUV, a brass key, a mountain road, and a warning. My phone vibrated. I pulled it from my pocket. A text message from my father. Where are you? A second message arrived before I could answer. The attorney said, You left with the car. Call me. Then another. This isn't something you should investigate on your own. I stared at the screen. Samuel noticed my expression. That's him. I nodded. Does he know where you are? No. Samuel's face became serious. Then don't tell him. I put the phone away. For the first time in my life, I realized that keeping something from my father might actually be necessary. I drove home later that night, with the black box hidden beneath my spare tire. When I reached my driveway, my father's black Mercedes was parked across the street. He was waiting. I stopped the Explorer. Dad stepped out. He looked at the old SUV, then at me. What did you find? I kept my face calm. Nothing. He stared at me. You drove 3 hours into the mountains. I wanted to see where the GPS went. Why curiosity? My father gave a small smile. It wasn't the same smile from the inheritance hearing. This one was nervous. Ethan, your grandfather was sick near the end. He wasn't thinking clearly. I looked at him. Maybe. Dad stepped closer. Whatever he told you, whatever you think you found, let it go. I said nothing. He lowered his voice. Some things are better left alone. Then he walked back toward his Mercedes. I watched him leave. For years, I had believed my father didn't care enough about me to pay attention. Now, I understood something far more frightening. He had been paying attention all along. I went inside, locked the door, and placed Arthur's letter on the kitchen table. Then, I opened my laptop. I searched the public records for the Carter Family Trust. The first result made my breath catch. The trust wasn't empty, it wasn't small, and according to the filing, I was the only individual beneficiary named in a sealed provision. I leaned back in my chair. My grandfather hadn't left me a used car because I was worth less than everyone else. He had left me the one thing my family would never think to steal from me until they knew what it was. A secret. And suddenly, I understood why he had trusted me with it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words on Arthur's letter. Do not confront your father. Do not tell Daniel what you found. The next morning, I called the estate attorney, Margaret Collins. She answered on the second ring. Ethan, yes. I found the documents. There was a pause. Then you found what Arthur wanted you to find. There's something I need to know. What exactly is the Carter Family Trust? I can't discuss the trust over the phone. Come to my office. I arrived early. Margaret closed her office door and placed a thick file on the desk. Your grandfather anticipated that you'd have questions. Did he know my father was stealing from the company? Margaret didn't answer immediately. We have evidence suggesting unauthorized transfers, but until the forensic review is complete, I won't call it theft. I appreciated her caution. Who was receiving the money? She opened the file. Several consulting companies. On paper, they were legitimate. In reality, their ownership structures were deliberately complicated. She slid a page toward me. I recognized one name immediately. My father's longtime business advisor. Another company was connected to Daniel. I stared at them. How much? Approximately $18 million over 7 years. $18 million, that's what we've identified so far. I leaned back. Why didn't Grandpa expose them? Because he wanted evidence strong enough to survive court. Margaret explained that Arthur had suspected financial misconduct, but refused to make accusations based on suspicion. He had hired an independent forensic accountant and quietly moved certain assets away from family control. Then she told me something that changed everything. Arthur also knew someone was monitoring his communications. I looked at her. Who we don't know, but he suspected my father. Yes. I thought about Dad appearing outside my house asking what I found. Margaret opened another folder. This is your grandfather's personal memorandum. I read the first line. If Ethan is reading this, the family has already begun asking what he received. I smiled. Arthur knew them too well. The memorandum explained why Ethan's inheritance looked insignificant. Arthur had intentionally separated the visible inheritance from the assets that mattered. The Explorer had been transferred to me because it was one of the few things nobody would fight over. Nobody would search it, nobody would suspect it, and nobody would imagine that a used vehicle contained the first clue to a financial investigation. But there was another reason. Arthur wrote that he wanted to know how the family would treat me when they believed I had received nothing, because it was true. I remembered Daniel laughing, my father's smile, the relatives who suddenly stopped making eye contact. Arthur had created a test, and my family had failed it before lunch. Margaret looked at me. There's more. She handed me a sealed document. This becomes active only under specific conditions. I opened it. The Carter Family Trust contained assets worth considerably more than I expected, but I couldn't access them immediately. There were conditions. I had to remain independent of the family business. I had to maintain complete financial records, and most importantly, I had to appoint an independent trustee if there was ever a conflict involving my immediate family. Arthur had thought of everything. I looked up. Why me? Margaret smiled gently. Because your grandfather believed you were the least interested in his money. That sentence stayed with me. I left with copies and drove to a forensic accounting firm. For the next 2 weeks, I kept working and paying my bills, while reviewing transaction records with the accountant at night. Patterns began to emerge. Payments were split into smaller amounts. Invoices were duplicated. Consulting fees were approved by people who benefited from them. My father had built a system. Daniel wasn't innocent either. He had received money through one of the companies. Then we found something worse. A transfer had been made shortly before Arthur's final hospitalization. It was large enough to trigger additional scrutiny. The recipient was a company controlled by Daniel. I stared at the screen. Did Grandpa know about this? The accountant nodded. That's probably why he accelerated the trust. I sat silently. Then I remembered something from childhood. My mother had once argued with Dad in the kitchen. I had been 12. She thought I was asleep. You're becoming someone your father would have hated, she told him. Dad had slammed a cabinet door. You don't understand what it takes to protect a family. At the time, I thought they were arguing about work. Now, I wasn't so sure. I searched my mother's old belongings. In a box of photographs, I found a notebook. Most of it contained grocery lists and ordinary family notes. Near the back were several handwritten pages. My mother's handwriting. She had written dates, company names, amounts, and one sentence. Arthur is right. Something is happening with the money, but Robert says I'm imagining things. I put the notebook down. My mother had known. Maybe not everything, but enough to be afraid. I sat there until midnight. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Dad knows you're digging. Another message appeared. You should stop before you embarrass yourself. I stared at the screen. For years, those words would have hurt. This time they didn't. I opened the file containing the financial records. Then I opened the photograph of my grandfather and Samuel at the mountain overlook. I understood what Arthur had wanted. He wasn't asking me to destroy my family. He was asking me to stop them from destroying themselves. I typed one reply to Daniel. I'm not digging for revenge. I paused, then added, I'm looking for the truth. I put the phone down. A minute later, it buzzed again. Daniel had replied, "You have no idea who you're fighting." I looked at those words. Then, for the first time since the hearing, I smiled. They still think I'm the fool, and that was their biggest mistake. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to confront my father. I wasn't going to confront Daniel, and I wasn't going to tell anyone in the family what Arthur had left me. For the first time in my life, I was going to let the truth speak for itself. I called Margaret and asked her to begin the formal process with the forensic accountants. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes, once we do this, Ethan, there won't be a way to put everything back the way it was." I looked at Arthur's letter sitting on my desk. I don't think it was ever the way my grandfather wanted it to be. That afternoon, the independent audit began. The family business had been operating for decades. It had hundreds of employees' contracts across several states and accountants who handled numbers far more complicated than anything I had ever dealt with. But fraud doesn't become invisible just because a company is large. It leaves patterns. And once someone knows where to look, those patterns become difficult to hide. The accountants followed the money. Payments had been divided between several consulting companies. Some invoices described services that had never been performed. Others listed vague business development expenses that were impossible to verify. Then they found something that connected everything. One of the shell companies was registered to a mailing address in Delaware. The address belonged to a law firm, but the beneficial owner was hidden behind another company. That company was connected to Daniel's investment account. I stared at the documents, so Daniel knew. Margaret nodded. "We can't know exactly what he knew yet, but the financial connection is significant." And my father. "We found transactions connected to an account controlled by an advisor who has worked with your father for more than 20 years. I closed my eyes. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. Then my phone rang. It was Daniel. I almost didn't answer. Finally I did. "What?" His voice was unusually calm. "We need to talk about what you know." "I don't," he exhaled. "Ethan, Dad is willing to make this worth your while." I leaned back. "What does that mean?" "It means you walk away. You stop cooperating with the accountants, and Dad will give you $5 million. For a moment, I said nothing. $5 million, a number that could change someone's life, a number my family apparently believed would change mine enough to make me disappear. I thought about the inheritance hearing, the laughter, the used car. Then I remembered Arthur's words. "Money is only a tool." "No." Daniel's voice hardened. "You're making a mistake." "I don't think so. You have no idea what you're getting into." "I know exactly what I'm getting into." "No, you don't." He paused. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. "Grandpa wasn't as innocent as you think." My hand tightened around the phone. "What does that mean?" "Ask yourself why he didn't tell you any of this while he was alive. Maybe he was waiting for me to find out myself." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You really believe he chose you because you're special?" I didn't answer. "Ethan, you were always the one who stayed outside the family business. You think that makes you better than us?" "No." "Then stop acting like it." The call ended. I sat there staring at the phone. For years I had believed Daniel's arrogance came from insecurity. Now I understood it came from fear. He was afraid of losing something. Not money, control. The next day, I met with Margaret again. She told me the audit had uncovered enough evidence to warrant formal legal action. "We're turning everything over," I nodded. "Do it." Within weeks, the atmosphere inside the Carter organization changed. Executives who had once answered my father's calls immediately stopped returning them. Bank representatives requested documentation. Outside counsel began reviewing contracts. The board ordered a deeper investigation, and then the news reached the family. Relatives who had laughed at me began calling. My cousin Rachel was the first. "Ethan, I'm so sorry." "For what?" "For what happened at the inheritance hearing." I almost smiled. "It's okay." "No, it isn't. We all thought you got nothing. You weren't the only one." She hesitated. "Do you know what Arthur actually left you?" I looked out the window. "Yes." "Are you going to tell everyone know why?" "Because that's exactly what everyone cared about." She didn't have an answer. Then came the other calls. An uncle wanted advice. A cousin wanted reassurance. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years asked if I could help protect their inheritance. I realized something painful. The moment people believed I might have money, they suddenly remembered that I was family. I refused every request, not because I wanted them to suffer, because I needed them to understand that relationships couldn't be bought back with the same currency that had destroyed them. One evening, I found Daniel standing outside my house. He looked different. No expensive suit, no confident smile, just a tired man standing beneath the porch light. "I need to talk to you." I opened the door but didn't invite him inside about what he looked down. "Dad," I waited. "He's scared, so am I." Daniel looked at me. "You shouldn't be." "Why?" "Because Grandpa planned all of this." I said nothing. Daniel continued. He knew Dad was moving money. That was the first time Daniel had admitted it directly. How long? Daniel swallowed. "Years." I felt something inside me go cold. "And you?" He looked away. "I took some." "How much?" He didn't answer. I didn't need him to. The investigation would tell us. Daniel looked back at me. "Ethan, I know I laughed at you. Yes, I know what I said. Yes. And I know I treated you like you were nothing." I stared at him. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing." That surprised me. "I just wanted you to know that I was wrong." Before I could respond, Daniel turned and walked away. I watched him disappear into the darkness. For the first time, I realized revenge wasn't going to feel the way I had imagined. I had spent years imagining the day my family would finally understand my worth. But now that day had arrived, and there was no satisfaction in watching people fall apart. There was only sadness. The following week, the investigation confirmed what Arthur had feared. Millions had been diverted. My father had approved suspicious transactions. Daniel had benefited from them, and both had helped conceal the financial trail. But there was one more revelation waiting for me. Margaret called me into her office. She placed a document on the desk. "This is the final provision of Arthur's trust." I read it, then I read it again. My grandfather hadn't simply protected money for me. He had created a charitable trust under my control. Veterans, working families, emergency assistants, scholarships. People who had the same problem my grandfather had once faced before he became wealthy. People who needed opportunity more than inheritance. I looked at Margaret. "He wanted me to do this. He wanted you to decide whether you were willing to carry the responsibility." I thought about the old SUV, the mountain, Samuel, the key, and the family that had laughed because they thought I had received nothing. For the first time, I understood the real revenge. It wasn't making them poor. It wasn't humiliating them. It was proving that the person they considered worthless could become the one person capable of preserving what Arthur had spent his life building. And then my father came to my door. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I need to tell you the truth." My father stood on my porch for nearly a minute before saying another word. He looked older than he had a month earlier. The confidence was gone, so was the polished expression he wore whenever money or business was involved. "I need to tell you the truth," he said. I stepped aside. "Come in." He entered slowly and sat at the kitchen table. For years, I had wanted my father to sit across from me like this, not as the head of the Carter family, not as the man everyone respected, but simply as my father. Now that it was finally happening, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he had to say. He stared at his hands. I knew. I waited. I knew money was being moved out of the company. My chest tightened. "How long?" "Several years." "Did Grandpa know?" "Yes." I looked away. "Then why didn't he stop you?" My father shook his head. "He tried." The room became silent. Dad explained that when Arthur started asking questions, he initially thought his father was simply becoming suspicious with age. But then Arthur hired outside investigators. Robert panicked. Not because he had personally created every transaction he claimed, but because he had allowed Daniel and several executives to use company money improperly. I told myself I was protecting the family. Dad said. I looked at him. By stealing from the family, he flinched. "I know how it sounds. It sounds exactly like what happened." He nodded. I was afraid. That answer surprised me. My father had always seemed afraid of nothing. "What were you afraid of?" "That I would never be enough." He looked toward the window. "Your grandfather built everything. Every room we lived in, every vacation, every opportunity. People compared me to him my entire life. And Daniel. I made the same mistake with him that my father made with me. I frowned. What mistake I taught him that money was proof of worth. Dad's voice cracked slightly. When you were young, you didn't care about any of that. You wanted to work with your hands. You liked fixing things. You could spend an entire afternoon repairing an old motorcycle and never ask how much it was worth. He gave a sad smile. I should have been proud. But you weren't. I was afraid. I looked at him. Afraid of me. Afraid that Arthur would respect you more than he respected me. That confession hurt more than I expected. I had spent years thinking my father simply didn't see me. The truth was worse. He saw me. He just saw me as a threat to his own insecurity. Why did you let Daniel laugh at me? Dad lowered his head because I was relieved when you weren't interested in the money. I stared at him. He continued. I thought if you stayed away from the business, you couldn't expose what was happening. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside the street looked completely ordinary. A neighbor was walking a dog. A delivery truck stopped at a house. Children were riding bicycles. Nobody looking at that quiet neighborhood would have guessed that one family was falling apart over millions of dollars. What happens now? I asked. Dad sighed. I'll have to face the consequences. That isn't an answer. No, he looked at me. I don't expect you to protect me. I turned around. Good. He nodded. I also don't expect forgiveness. I didn't respond because I didn't know if I could forgive him. Not yet. The investigation continued. The accountants recovered several million through frozen accounts and improperly transferred assets. Other money was harder to trace. My father cooperated after realizing the evidence was overwhelming. Daniel did too eventually. Neither cooperation erased what they had done. There were legal consequences, financial consequences, and consequences inside the family that money couldn't repair. But something else happened. For the first time, my father stopped trying to control the outcome. He stopped calling relatives, stopped pressuring attorneys, stopped trying to convince everyone that he had been misunderstood. He simply accepted responsibility. That mattered to me, not enough to erase the past, but enough to leave a door open. A few weeks later, I drove the old Explorer back to the mountain overlook. Samuel was there. He was sitting on the hood of his pickup, drinking coffee from a metal thermos. You look different, he said. I feel different. He handed me a cup. I sat beside him, my father confessed. Samuel nodded. Arthur expected that. He expected everything. Samuel smiled. That was Arthur. I pulled the final letter from my jacket. I found something else in the trust documents. What Arthur created a charitable fund. Samuel looked at me. For veterans, working families, scholarships, emergency assistance. Samuel smiled. He wanted you to understand where the money came from. What do you mean Arthur never forgot what it felt like to need help? Samuel looked out over the valley. When he started his first company, he had almost nothing. People gave him opportunities. He believed the right thing to do was pass that opportunity forward. I looked at the mountains. I thought my inheritance was a punishment. Samuel chuckled. That was the point. I smiled. Then he said something I'll never forget. Your grandfather didn't trust you with money, Ethan. I looked at him. He trusted you with what money could become. For the first time since the inheritance hearing, I felt the weight in my chest begin to lift. I finally understood. Arthur hadn't wanted me to win against my family. He wanted me to win against the temptation to become like them. A few days later, Daniel called. I want to apologize. I sat quietly while he spoke. I laughed at you. Yes, I thought you were beneath me. Yes, I was wrong. I could hear the shame in his voice. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know if I can yet, I understand. We stayed silent. Then I said, but I don't want us to spend the rest of our lives hating each other. Daniel took a breath. Neither do I. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were no hugs, no dramatic promises. Just two brothers admitting that something had gone terribly wrong and deciding not to make it worse. That was enough for one day. My father eventually began rebuilding his life outside the family business. Daniel sold several unnecessary properties and began repaying what he could. And I started the charitable trust. I helped fund veteran housing program, scholarships, and emergency grants for working families. The first time I signed a grant check, I thought about the used Explorer sitting in my driveway, a car worth a fraction of what everyone else had received. Yet that car had taken me to the truth. It had taken me to Samuel. It had taken me to Arthur's final lesson. And it had taken me back to myself. Months later, I drove the Explorer to the mountain again. I parked beside the overlook and looked at the valley below. For years, I had thought wealth meant having more than everyone else. Or further taught me something different. Wealth could mean having enough courage to tell the truth, enough wisdom to walk away from greed, enough humility to forgive without forgetting, and enough compassion to use what you have to help someone else stand back up. I finally understood why my grandfather gave me the inheritance nobody wanted. The used car wasn't worthless. It was a roadmap, and I had finally learned how to follow it. The first time I took the Explorer to my father's house after everything was over, I almost turned around. For years, that house had represented everything I thought I had failed to become. My father had built his life around appearances. The right neighborhood, the right car, the right business connections, the right son. And for most of my childhood, I thought that son was Daniel. But that afternoon, something had changed. My father was standing on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway. He looked at the old Explorer and smiled faintly. "I still can't believe Arthur left you that thing." I laughed. "Neither can I." Dad walked toward the vehicle. "Does it still run better than most people in this family?" He laughed. It was the first time we'd laughed together in years. We stood beside the Explorer for a moment without saying anything. Then Dad looked at me. "I owe you an apology." I didn't answer immediately. "I've apologized before," he continued, "but I don't think I ever actually told you what I'm sorry for." I waited. "I spent years making you feel like you weren't enough." His voice became quieter. "I compared you to Daniel. I compared you to Arthur. I compared you to every successful person I knew. And I made you believe that if you weren't wealthy, powerful, or impressive, you didn't matter." I looked down. He was right. There were birthdays when Daniel received expensive gifts and I received a handshake. There were family dinners where Daniel's business stories lasted an hour while my work was barely mentioned. There were moments when I wanted my father's approval so badly that I changed parts of myself just to earn it. Eventually, I stopped trying. "I should have told you I was proud of you," Dad said. I looked at him. "Why didn't you?" He swallowed. "Because I was jealous." That word hung between us. Not anger, not greed, jealousy. It was the one thing my father had never admitted. "I was jealous because Arthur trusted you." I looked toward the mountains in the distance. "I didn't know that he did." Dad smiled sadly. "Your grandfather used to tell me that you were the one person in the family who didn't need him." I felt something tighten in my chest. He said that more than once. I shook my head. "I wish I'd known." "So do I." We stood there quietly. Then Dad said, "I know forgiveness doesn't happen because I ask for it." "No, I know. But it can happen because you change." He nodded. "I am trying." That was all I needed to hear. Not a promise that everything would be perfect. Just an admission that change required work. Later that week, Daniel came to see me. He looked uncomfortable standing in my doorway. I brought something. He handed me a small cardboard box. Inside was an old family photograph. Arthur stood in the center. My father was beside him. Daniel was a little boy, and I was maybe 6 years old standing near my grandfather's leg. I turned the photograph over. There was handwriting on the back. "The boys will understand someday." I stared at it. "Grandpa wrote this." Daniel nodded. "I found it in Dad's desk." I smiled sadly. Maybe he knew. He usually did. Daniel sat down for a while. Neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I'm sorry." I looked at him. "I know." "No, Ethan. I really am." He looked down at his hands. "I spent my entire life thinking I had to beat you." "You didn't. I know that now." He laughed quietly. "That's the stupid part. You weren't even competing with me." "No, I was competing with a version of you that existed in my head." That was probably the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me. I didn't forgive him instantly. Real forgiveness doesn't work that way. But I decided I didn't want anger to become another inheritance. We agreed to stay in contact slowly, carefully, one conversation at a time. Some things would never return to the way they had been. Maybe that was okay. Some families don't need to go backward. They need to move forward differently. By then, the Carter Charitable Trust was operating. The first scholarships went to students whose parents worked hourly jobs. The first emergency grants helped families pay medical bills and rent after unexpected layoffs. We also partnered with organizations supporting veterans transitioning into civilian life. I signed every approval personally, not because I wanted control, because I wanted to remember what Arthur had taught me. Money wasn't the destination, it was the vehicle. And suddenly, the old explorer sitting outside my office seemed almost funny. A billionaire had given his grandson a used car, and somehow that car had carried more meaning than millions of dollars. One Saturday morning, I drove back to the mountain overlook. Samuel was waiting. He was older than he looked when I first met him, but there was still strength in his posture. "You came back," he said. "I wanted to say thank you." He waved me off. "Thank your grandfather." "I already did." Samuel smiled. We stood beside the railing. The valley below was covered in golden morning light. I thought about the day I had arrived there, angry and confused. I thought I had been cheated. I thought everyone else had won. I thought my grandfather had chosen me last. I couldn't have been more wrong. He had given me a test. And more importantly, he had given me a choice. I could become bitter. I could spend my life trying to punish everyone who had underestimated me. Or I could take what happened, learn from it, and use the opportunity to become someone my grandfather would have been proud of. I chose the second. Before I left, I sat inside the Explorer and turned on the GPS. The save destination still said home. I smiled. For the first time, I understood what Arthur had meant. Home wasn't a house, it wasn't a bank account, it wasn't a family name. Home was the place where you could finally stop proving your worth. I turned off the GPS. Then I started the engine. As I drove down the mountain, I realized the greatest revenge wasn't watching my father lose everything. It wasn't watching my brother apologize. It wasn't proving that I was worth more than they thought. The greatest revenge was refusing to become the kind of person who had hurt me. My grandfather left millions behind. But what he really left me was something harder to measure. Wisdom, responsibility, and the courage to choose who I wanted to become. Maybe that's the lesson worth remembering. Sometimes, life gives you something that looks worthless, because you're looking at its price instead of its purpose. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are accidentally giving you freedom. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means learning from it without allowing it to poison the rest of your life. So, if this story reminded you of someone who was underestimated, betrayed, or judged by what they had instead of who they were, share it with them. And if you've ever discovered that the hardest seasons of your life were secretly preparing you for something better, I'd love for you to stay with me for the next story. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves in your name. The lawyer placed a folder on my kitchen table and looked at me like I was already guilty. "My client believes you have an obligation to share your inheritance with the Carter family," he said. Across from him, my mother-in-law smiled. It was the same smile she had worn at my wedding 6 days earlier. Polite, elegant, almost affectionate. Now it looked different. I glanced at the folder, then at Evelyn Carter. "You came to my house with a lawyer," I said quietly, "to ask me for money." She crossed her arms. "Not just money, Claire, family money." My heart was pounding, but my voice stayed steady, because there was something neither of them knew. They had no idea how much money I actually had, and they certainly didn't know what my father had instructed me to do if anyone ever came asking. "My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 32 years old, a captain in the United States Army, and until that morning, I had been trying to convince myself that marrying Michael Carter had been the right decision. 6 days earlier, I had stood beside him in a small church outside Washington, D.C., surrounded by family, friends, and a handful of people from my military life. My father wasn't there. General Daniel Morgan had been gone for 11 months. He had been a 4-star general before retirement, a man who had spent more than 4 decades serving his country. To most people, he was disciplined, intimidating, and impossible to impress. To me, he was simply Dad. He had taught me how to fold a uniform properly, how to keep my word when nobody was watching, and how to stay calm when everyone else was losing their heads. But there was one lesson he repeated more than any other: never tell people what you have until you know what they value. I had never fully understood what he meant until my wedding. Michael knew my father had left me an inheritance. He knew there were investments and property involved. I had told him that Dad had arranged things before he died, but I never told him the number, not even once. The number was $68 million. It wasn't money I believed made me better than anyone else. It was the result of decades of investments, family holdings, and assets my father had carefully protected. The inheritance was held in a trust structured by attorneys my father had known for years, and Dad had left very specific instructions. The money was mine, not Michael's, not his mother's, not anyone else's. Mine. I had kept the amount secret because I wanted one simple answer. Would my future husband love me if I had nothing? For the first year we dated, Michael gave me every reason to believe the answer was yes. He never asked about my salary. He never complained about my military schedule. When I had to leave for training, he brought me coffee before dawn and told me he was proud of me. That was the man I thought I knew. His mother was different. Evelyn had always been gracious in public, but there was something calculating beneath her manners. She asked questions that sounded harmless. What did your father do with his investments? Did he leave you the family home? I always answered vaguely. Michael usually changed the subject. So, when I married him, I thought the secret was safe. 6 days after our wedding, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when the doorbell rang. Evelyn stood outside. Besides her was a man in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Good morning, Claire," she said. I looked at the man. "My attorney." My stomach tightened. "Why?" "We need to discuss your inheritance." I stared at her. She sat at my kitchen table as if she owned the house. The attorney opened his briefcase. "I'll be direct," he said. "Your marriage creates certain financial considerations, not where my inheritance is concerned." Evelyn leaned toward me. "Your father was a powerful man. He understood family obligations." I almost laughed. "My father understood boundaries." Her expression hardened. "Claire, Michael is your husband now. What belongs to you belongs to the family you married into." "No," I said. "That's not how inheritance works." The attorney slid a document toward me. "There's a proposed financial agreement here. It would establish shared access to certain inherited assets." I didn't touch it. Instead, I looked at the top page. There were details about my trust. Details that only a handful of people should have known. My mouth went dry. "How did you get this information?" Neither of them answered. I looked at Evelyn. Then I looked at the attorney. Finally, I asked the question that mattered. "Did Michael tell you?" Evelyn smiled again. That same wedding smile. "Michael doesn't need to tell me everything," she said. A cold feeling moved through me. I reached for my phone. I called my husband. He answered after the third ring. "Hey, Claire." "Michael, I said your mother is here with a lawyer." Silence. Not surprise, not confusion. Silence. Then he whispered, "What?" I closed my eyes. "She's asking me to sign documents about my inheritance." Another silence. Longer this time. And in that silence, I realized something that hurt more than the lawyer, more than the documents, and more than Evelyn's entitlement. Michael knew something. Maybe not everything, but something. "Claire," he finally said, "maybe we should talk about this when I get home." I looked at the woman sitting across from me. Evelyn was watching my face carefully. She already knew. She had come prepared. And suddenly, my father's final warning came back to me with painful clarity. Never react when you're angry. Never reveal what you know. And above all, never show your enemy the full battlefield. I opened my eyes. "Okay," I told Michael. "We'll talk when you get home." Then I hung up. For the first time since my wedding, I wasn't thinking like a newlywed. I was thinking like my father's daughter, and I knew the next move mattered. By the time Michael came home that evening, Evelyn and her attorney were gone. I had spent the afternoon sitting at the kitchen table with the document spread out in front of me, reading every page without signing a single line. The more I read, the worse it became. The agreement wasn't simply asking me to share my inheritance. It would have given Michael access to financial information, created joint control over certain assets, and opened the door for his family to argue that the money should be used for household and family obligations. It was written in polite legal language, but I knew exactly what it meant. Once I signed it, getting that control back would be difficult. I heard the garage door open around 7 Lither. A few seconds later, Michael walked into the kitchen. He looked tired or guilty. I couldn't tell which. He set his keys on the counter and looked at me. "Where's my mom gone? And the lawyer gone too?" He nodded slowly. I watched him remove his jacket. "You knew they were coming." He stopped. "I knew my mom wanted to talk to you. That wasn't my question." He looked down. "I knew she was upset. Michael." He finally looked at me. "Yes." The word was quiet, but it landed heavily. I pushed the documents across the table. "She brought this." He didn't touch them. "I didn't know she'd bring a lawyer. But you knew she was going to ask about my inheritance." He hesitated. "Yes." I leaned back in my chair. For a moment I couldn't find the right words. Not because I was surprised, because I was disappointed. "When did you find out?" "A few weeks ago." My chest tightened. "A few weeks?" He nodded. "How?" "My mother heard something from one of your father's old business associates." I stared at him. "That makes no sense." "Why?" "Because the amount was confidential." He looked away. That tiny movement told me more than his answer could have. "You knew the amount, didn't you? You knew it was substantial." "I knew your father had left you money." "How much?" Michael didn't answer. I stood. "How much did you know?" "Claire?" "I don't remember." I almost smiled. "You don't remember hearing about $68 million? His face changed. There it was. The reaction I'd been waiting for. He knew, maybe not every detail, but he knew the number. And suddenly, the last few weeks of our marriage looked different. The questions about my father's estate, the strange conversation he'd started about buying a bigger house, the way his mother had recently asked whether I planned to continue serving in the army after we started a family. At the time I had thought they were normal questions. Now they felt like pieces of a puzzle. "Did you tell your mother the amount?" "No." "Did you tell her anything?" Michael rubbed his forehead. "I might have mentioned that your father left you more than we expected." I closed my eyes. More than we expected. Those words bothered me. Because he had just turned my inheritance into something that belonged to both of us. We. He looked at me. "What you said we expected." "I didn't mean it that way." "How did you mean it?" He couldn't answer. I walked toward the window. Outside, our quiet suburban street looked completely ordinary. A neighbor was bringing groceries inside. A couple walked their dog. A teenager was shooting basketballs in a driveway. Nothing had changed except everything had changed. "I never told you the amount," I said. "I know." "Why didn't you ask?" "Because I didn't care." I turned around. "Then why is your mother asking me to sign a document giving you access to it?" He looked ashamed. "I didn't ask her to do that." "But you didn't stop her." He sat down. For the first time I saw fear in his expression. "Claire, my family is struggling." I said nothing. "My parents have debts. My mother thinks your inheritance could solve everything. She thinks families help each other. That's not what this is." "I know." "No, Michael, you don't." My voice remained calm, but I could feel the anger underneath it. "Your mother didn't come here because she wanted to welcome me into the family. She came here 6 days after our wedding with a lawyer and information about my private trust." He looked down. "I know. Do you?" "Yes." "Then tell me how she got it." He was silent. That silence lasted long enough for me to understand that he either knew or had a very good idea. I sat across from him. "Michael, I need the truth. Not the version that makes your family look better." He swallowed. "My mother has been asking questions." "What kind of questions about your father's estate?" "When?" "Before the wedding." My heart sank. "How long?" "Maybe 2 months." 2 months? While I had been choosing flowers, arranging seating, and trying to balance my military schedule with wedding preparations, his mother had been investigating my inheritance. "Did you know?" At first I thought she was just curious, and later I realized she wasn't. "What did you do?" He looked at me. "I told her to leave it alone." "Did she know?" I stood again. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid." That answer stopped me. "Afraid of what?" "Losing you." I looked at him for several seconds. "You should have been more afraid of losing my trust." He lowered his eyes. That night I didn't sleep beside him. I took a blanket to the guest room and closed the door, but instead of crying, I did something my father had taught me during my first year as an officer. I separated facts from feelings. Fact 1, Michael knew about the inheritance. Fact 2, his mother knew the amount. Fact 3, a lawyer had prepared documents. Fact 4, someone had obtained confidential information about my trust. And fact 5, Michael was not telling me everything. The next morning I called my father's estate attorney. Robert Hayes. Robert had represented my father for nearly 15 years. He was one of the few people I trusted completely. When he answered, I didn't waste time. Robert, someone has information about my trust. There was a pause. What kind of information? The amount, the structure, details about the assets. His voice became serious. Did you disclose anything to your husband? No. Then, we have a problem. I thought so. Claire, I need you to come to my office. I drove into Washington that morning. Robert's office was in an older brick building, where my father had spent countless hours reviewing contracts and estate documents. He closed the blinds before speaking. Someone attempted to access your trust records last month. I stared at him. Who? We don't know for certain. Then how did you know it was an attempt? Because the request came through a third party using information connected to your husband. My stomach dropped. Michael? We can't say he personally made the request, but someone used his information. Yes. Robert opened a file. Then he removed a sealed envelope. This was left by your father. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father's handwriting. Robert looked at me. He gave me strict instructions. I was not to deliver this, unless someone attempted to interfere with your inheritance. My fingers trembled as I reached for the envelope. What does it say? Robert's expression softened. I think your father expected this day might come. I looked down at the seal. 11 months I had avoided opening anything that made his death feel real, but now, holding that envelope, I understood. My father had not simply left me money. He had left me a warning. And whatever was inside that letter could change everything I thought I knew about my marriage. I broke the seal with my thumb. For a few seconds, I couldn't bring myself to unfold the paper. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. Strong letters, slightly slanted, precise. The same handwriting I had seen on birthday cards, military commendations, and handwritten notes he'd left on my kitchen counter. I finally opened the letter. My eyes landed on the first line. Claire, if you're reading this, someone has tried to get access to what I left you. I stopped breathing. Robert quietly closed the office door. I continued reading. Do not confront them until you understand what they're trying to accomplish. My father knew me too well. He knew I would want answers immediately. He knew I would want to call Michael, confront Evelyn, and demand an explanation. Instead, he was telling me to wait, to observe, to think. I kept reading. The money is not the important part. The people who reveal themselves because of it are. My vision blurred. I had heard those words in different forms my entire life. Dad never cared much about money. He cared about character. He had grown up in a working-class family in Pennsylvania, long before anyone called him General Morgan. He used to tell me that his first military paycheck felt enormous because, at 19, he had never had much money of his own. He believed money should give you freedom to make good decisions, not permission to make careless ones. The letter continued. I chose you as the sole beneficiary because you have demonstrated something I cannot buy or teach with money restraint. I swallowed hard. Then came the sentence that made my hands tremble. If someone attempts to convince you that marriage automatically gives them control over this inheritance, remember that inheritance and marital property are not the same thing. Get independent legal advice before signing anything. I looked up at Robert. He knew. Robert nodded. He knew there might be a problem. He was concerned about people around you. Who? Robert hesitated. Your father never gave me a name. I looked back at the letter. There was more. I have also asked Robert to preserve records concerning several financial inquiries made by people connected to individuals who may eventually approach you. If that happens, don't assume the person standing in front of you is the person controlling the situation. I read that paragraph twice. Someone connected to individuals. Not one person. People. My stomach tightened. Then I reached the final paragraph. Claire, you will be tempted to think you can solve this by giving them enough money to make the problem disappear. Don't. Once you pay someone who believes they are entitled to you, there will always be another demand. I folded the letter slowly. For the first time since my father's death, I cried. Not because I was afraid, because I missed him. I missed the certainty of having someone older and wiser in the room. Someone who could look at a complicated situation and reduce it to one clear question. What is right? Robert handed me a tissue. He loved you very much, I know. He was proud of you. I wiped my eyes. I just wish he'd told me more. Robert smiled sadly. He probably thought he had. That sounded exactly like my father. I took a breath. Show me the records. Robert opened another folder. Inside were copies of several inquiries made about my trust. One had been submitted through a financial consultant. Another had come from an attorney's office. The third had been made through a property company. And attached to the third request was a name. Carter Family Holdings. I stared at it. That's Evelyn's family. Robert nodded. Your mother-in-law's husband owned several commercial properties. The company has been struggling. How badly? Robert slid another document toward me. I read the numbers. Millions in debt, outstanding loans, tax liens, a pending foreclosure on one property. I looked up. How long has this been going on? Several years. I felt something inside me go cold. Michael had never told me, neither had Evelyn. Robert continued, there is something else. He handed me a printed email. The message was between two people I didn't recognize. The subject line read, Claire Morgan Marriage and Trust. I read it. The writer discussed the possibility of convincing me to combine my inherited assets with marital finances after the wedding. One sentence stood out. Once she's married, she'll be more emotionally vulnerable to pressure from her husband. My hands went numb. Who wrote this? We're still investigating. Does Michael know about it? I don't know. I closed my eyes. I wanted to believe he didn't. I desperately wanted to believe that, because despite everything, I still loved him. That was the most painful part. If I hated him, this would have been easier, but I didn't. I loved the man who had waited outside the airport for me after a deployment away. I loved the man who had once told me that my uniform was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen me wear. I loved the man I thought he was. And now, I didn't know whether that man had ever really existed. I drove home that afternoon without calling him. When I walked through the front door, Michael was sitting on the couch. He stood immediately. Where were you? At my attorney's office. His face tightened. Why? Because your mother brought a lawyer into our home, I know. No, you don't. I placed my purse on the table. I know about the financial inquiries. His expression changed. What inquiries? Don't. I had never spoken to him that way before. He stopped. Claire, did you or your mother try to access my trust? No. Did you give anyone information about my inheritance? No. Did you know your family has millions in debt? He stared at me. Who told you that? That wasn't an answer. I felt something break inside me. You did know. I knew about my parents' financial problems, and you still let your mother come here asking for my money. I didn't know what she planned to do. You knew enough. He ran both hands through his hair. I was trying to protect everyone except me. He looked wounded. That isn't fair, neither was what happened. He stepped closer. I love you. I wanted to believe him, but love wasn't enough anymore. Then tell me the truth. He looked down. My mother has been talking about your inheritance for weeks. How much does she want? He didn't answer. How much? Enough to pay off the family debt. I stared at him. That's millions of dollars. I know, and she expects me to give it to her. She thinks you should help. I shook my head. No, she thinks you should help her convince me. Michael said nothing. That silence was my answer. I walked past him. Where are you going? To the guest room. Claire, I stopped at the hallway. I don't know if our marriage can survive this. His face fell. But I know one thing. I turned around. I'm not giving your family $1. That night, I placed my father's letter in the drawer beside my bed. Then I read it one more time. The final sentence stayed with me. Don't confuse forgiveness with surrender. I realized my father hadn't left me a weapon. He had left me something better, a warning. And now, for the first time, I was ready to find out exactly who had planned to take what he left me. The next morning before sunrise. That had always been normal for me. Years in the army had trained my body to wake before the alarm, before the neighborhood came alive, before the first commuter cars filled the streets. But that morning felt different. I wasn't waking up for duty. I was waking up because I finally understood that I was in the middle of a battle I had never agreed to fight. I made coffee, put my hair into a tight bun, and sat at the kitchen table with my father's letter beside me. Then I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Evelyn, not yet. I wasn't going to accuse Michael, not yet. I was going to let them believe I was confused. My father had taught me something during my first leadership course. When you don't understand the enemy's objective, he had told me, don't rush forward, give them room to reveal it. So I did exactly that. At 9 that morning, I called Evelyn. She answered almost immediately. Claire, her voice sounded pleasant, almost relieved. I've been thinking about yesterday, I said. I knew you would. I don't want there to be conflict between us. That makes two of us. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, maybe we should meet. There was a brief pause. I'd like that. Lunch? Of course. We met at a quiet restaurant in Bethesda. Evelyn arrived wearing a cream-colored jacket, pearl earrings, and the expression of a woman who believed she had already won. She hugged me when she saw me. I allowed it. I'm glad you're being reasonable, she said. I smiled politely. I've had time to think. She sat across from me. You're young, Claire. You don't understand how complicated marriage can become when money is involved. I understand that. Michael is your husband. I know. And your inheritance is substantial. I looked directly at her. How substantial? She smiled. Your father was a very successful man. That isn't what I asked. She leaned closer. $68 million. Dollars. My heart sank. Not because she knew, because she said the exact number. I had never told Michael. I had never told anyone in his family. I folded my hands beneath the table so she wouldn't see my fingers tighten. How did you find out? Evelyn shrugged. People talk. About private trusts, Claire, don't be naive. There it was. The arrogance, the assumption that because she was older, wealthier, and more socially connected, she could talk around the truth. She reached into her purse. I brought something. She placed another document on the table. This is a reasonable arrangement. I didn't touch it. What does it do? It gives Michael authority to manage certain investments. Why? Because as military officer, your career is demanding. I almost smiled. So you think my career makes me incapable of managing my own money? That's not what I said. You implied it, she sighed. I'm trying to protect my son. From what? From being financially excluded from his own marriage. I stared at her. My inheritance existed before I married him. That doesn't mean it shouldn't benefit your husband. Shouldn't it be my decision? She looked irritated. Marriage isn't a business transaction. No, I said quietly. Which is why I'm surprised you're asking me to sign a financial agreement 6 days after my wedding. Her expression hardened. You're making this difficult. No, I'm asking questions, she leaned back. Your father didn't raise you to be selfish. That sentence hit differently. For a moment, I felt anger rise in my chest. Then I remembered his letter. Don't react. I smiled. You're right. She looked pleased. I knew you'd understand. I do understand. I pushed the document back toward her. I understand exactly what you're asking. Her smile disappeared. I won't sign it. She stared at me. Claire, I won't sign anything that gives your family control over my inheritance. You're making a serious mistake, maybe. I stood, but it's my mistake to make. I left before she could respond. That afternoon I met Robert again. I gave him the document. He read it carefully. This is worse than the first version. How? This one contains language that could create arguments about control over inherited assets if you later use them for joint purchases. So, they want me to sign something before they know whether I'll agree to anything else. Exactly. I sat back. Can we prove they planned this before the wedding? We may be able to. He opened another file. We found something. He handed me printed emails. One was from Evelyn to Michael. The date was 3 weeks before our wedding. Once you're married, she'll have a harder time saying no. Don't pressure her before the ceremony. I stared at the sentence, then another message. She trusts you. Use that. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I read it again, then again. Michael had received those messages, and he hadn't shown them to me. Did he respond? Robert nodded. He pointed to the next page. Michael had written, I don't want to hurt her. Evelyn replied, you're not hurting her. You're securing your family's future. I closed my eyes. For one brief moment, I wanted to believe that Michael's message meant he had tried to resist. Then I saw the final response. I'll talk to her after the wedding. My stomach turned. The wedding. The moment when I had stood beside him and promised to love him. The moment when my father had been absent because he was already gone. The moment I had believed I was beginning a new family. They had been planning something behind my back before I even walked down the aisle. I looked at Robert. What do I do? Protect yourself legally. And Michael? That depends on whether he continues cooperating with his mother. I nodded. That evening, I went home and found Michael waiting in the living room. He looked exhausted. My mother called me, he said. I know. She told me you refused. I did. He sat down. Claire, please. I remained standing. Did you know about the emails? His face went pale. What emails? Don't lie to me. He stared at the floor. I placed copies on the coffee table. He looked at them. His shoulders dropped. I was going to tell you. When? After we settled down. After you got me to sign? No, then? When he couldn't answer. I felt tears forming, but I refused to let them fall. You let your mother plan this before our wedding. I didn't agree with everything she wanted, but you agreed to wait until after the wedding. He covered his face. I was scared. Of what? Of losing my family. I nodded slowly. And you thought you could risk losing me instead? He looked up. I love you. I believe you. He looked surprised. But love without courage isn't enough. The room went silent. I picked up my father's letter from the table. My father warned me that people might reveal themselves because of this money. Michael stared at it. I never wanted your money. Then prove it. How? Tell your mother no. He looked terrified. I had my answer. That night I moved my father's letter into a locked drawer. Then I contacted my attorney and asked him to begin formal steps to protect every asset my father had left me. I wasn't filing for divorce, not yet. I wasn't destroying my marriage, not yet. But I was done pretending this was a misunderstanding. If Evelyn wanted to fight over my inheritance, she had chosen the wrong woman. Because I wasn't going to fight her with anger. I was going to fight her with facts. And the next document we uncovered would prove that the plan against me was much bigger than I had imagined. The document arrived on a Tuesday morning. Robert called me while I was getting ready for work. Claire, I need you to come in. His voice was different, not frightened, serious. What happened? We found something connected to Michael. I was silent for a moment. I'm coming. I drove into Washington through the morning traffic, my mind running through every possibility. By then, I had stopped expecting good news. Still, I wasn't prepared for what Robert placed on his desk. It was a financial agreement. Not the one Evelyn had brought to my house. Not the one she had tried to get me to sign at lunch. This was something different. It was an internal agreement between Michael and a company called Carter Family Holdings. I read the first page, then the second. My hands began to shake. What is this? Robert folded his hands. Your husband's family owns several commercial properties. They've been carrying significant debt for years. I know. This agreement was prepared before your wedding. I looked at him. What does it say? Robert pointed to a section near the bottom. It outlines how certain debts would be paid if additional capital became available to the family. I kept reading. Then I saw my name. Not as a beneficiary, not as an owner, as a potential source of funds. My stomach turned. They planned to use my inheritance to pay these debts. Robert nodded. That's what it appears to show. I looked at the date, 3 weeks before my wedding. 3 weeks before Michael stood beside me and promised to build a life together. Before I put a ring on his finger. Before I told him I loved him. They had already discussed my money. I pushed the document away. Does Michael's signature appear here? Robert didn't answer immediately. Yes. I closed my eyes. For a few seconds, the office disappeared. I was back at the church. I could hear the music. I could see Michael waiting for me. I remembered the way he smiled when he saw me. I remembered thinking, this is the man I can trust. Then I opened my eyes. Can we prove this was connected to my inheritance? We can prove the agreement existed, but not that Michael intended to force me. No. I nodded. That matters. It does. I sat quietly. I wasn't interested in destroying someone simply because I was hurt. I wanted the truth, and I wanted to protect myself. That afternoon I went home. Michael was there. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. When he saw me, he stood. Claire. I placed the agreement on the table. He looked at it. His face changed immediately. Where did you get that? Your family records. He stared at the document. You weren't supposed to see that. I felt something inside me go completely still. That's your first response? He closed his eyes. I didn't mean it like that. How did you mean it? I was going to tell you. He sat down. I remained, standing. Did you sign this? Sign this? Yes. The word was barely audible. I nodded. Why? My mother pressured me. You're a grown man, I know. You had a choice. I know. Then why? He looked at me because I thought if I didn't help my parents would lose everything, and you thought I should pay for it. No, but that's what the agreement says. I never expected you to actually give us $68 million. I stared at him. Then what did you expect? He swallowed. Maybe a few million. The words hit me harder than a shout. A few million, as if it were nothing, as if the money had no meaning because my father had earned it, as if my life had suddenly become a bank account. I sat across from him. How much did your mother tell you she needed? About 4 million? And how much did she expect to get from me? I don't know. You signed an agreement without knowing. Knowing? He looked away. I nodded slowly. That's the problem, Michael. He looked back. You weren't just manipulated by your mother. You participated. Tears filled his eyes. I know. For the first time, he didn't defend himself. He didn't blame Evelyn. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He simply sat there, and somehow that made the betrayal feel more real. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It's my mother. Answer it. He hesitated, put it on speaker. He looked nervous, but he answered. Mom, Evelyn's voice came through immediately. Did she sign? Michael looked at me. No. There was a pause. Then Evelyn said something that made my blood run cold. Then you need to make her understand what happens if she doesn't cooperate. I reached for the phone. I'm listening. Silence. Claire. Yes. Her voice changed. You shouldn't be listening to private family conversations. You called my husband about my money. Because you're being unreasonable. No, I'm being careful. You don't understand what your father would have wanted. That sentence made me angry. You didn't know my father. I knew his reputation. You knew nothing about him. She became defensive. Your father was a powerful man. He understood that families support one another. My father also believed people should earn what they receive. She hung up. Michael stared at the phone. I looked at him. That's the last time she uses you to speak to me. He nodded. I know. No, you need to decide something. What, your mother or our marriage? His face crumpled. Claire, I am not asking you to abandon your family. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to stop allowing your family to use our marriage as a financial strategy. He sat quietly for a long time. Finally he said, I'll tell her no. I wanted to believe him, but words weren't enough anymore. The following week our attorneys arranged mediation. Evelyn arrived with her lawyer. Michael arrived alone. That small detail told me something had changed. The mediator explained that the purpose wasn't to determine ownership of my inheritance. That was already clear. The purpose was to resolve the financial dispute and establish boundaries. Evelyn immediately accused me turning her son against her. I didn't respond. Robert placed the documents on the table. Bank records, emails, the financial agreement, the attempted trust inquiry. The mediator read everything carefully. Then she looked at Evelyn. Mrs. Carter, why was this agreement prepared before the marriage? Evelyn shifted in her chair. It was simply a precaution. Why was Miss Morgan's inheritance referenced? She was going to become part of our family. The mediator looked at Michael. Did you sign this? Yes. Did your wife know about it before the wedding? No. The room became silent. Michael looked at me. I was wrong. I believed him. Not because of the words, because for the first time he was willing to say them in front of everyone. Evelyn's expression hardened. This is ridiculous. She has $68 million and you're all acting as though she is the victim. I looked at her. I never asked you for anything. She opened her mouth. I continued. I didn't take your house. I didn't take your business. I didn't take your son's money. I paused. You came after mine. No one spoke. And in that silence, I finally understood what my father had meant. The money hadn't changed anyone. It had simply removed the mask. Months later, I realized the hardest part had not been protecting the $68 million. It had been deciding what to do with the people who had tried to take it. The mediation ended without Evelyn receiving a dollar. My inheritance remained legally separate, exactly as my father's estate plan intended. The Carter family's debts remained their responsibility, and Michael formally withdrew from the agreement he had signed before our wedding. But legal victory did not make everything feel better. Michael understood that I couldn't answer them quickly. He moved into a small apartment about 20 minutes from our house. We were still married, but separated. He didn't demand that I come back. He didn't ask me for money, and perhaps most importantly, he stopped making excuses for his mother. A few weeks after the mediation, Michael called me. "What is it?" "My mother wants me to challenge the trust. Are you going to?" "No," I told her. "I'm done." I sat quietly. "Why are you telling me?" "Because I should have told you everything before." His voice cracked. "I was afraid of my mother. I spent my whole life trying to keep her happy. I thought if I kept everyone calm, somehow nobody would get hurt. Someone did get hurt." "I know. I'm sorry. I appreciate you saying that," I told him. "But we're not going back to normal, I understand. And if we ever have a future, it has to be different. It will be." Over the next several months, I watched. Michael separated his finances from his parents. He refused to co-sign another loan for his family. He told Evelyn that my inheritance was not available to them. When she became angry, he didn't call me to mediate. He handled it himself. Meanwhile, I returned to my military duties. There was something comforting about putting on my uniform again. In the army, responsibilities were clear. You were accountable for your decisions. One afternoon, Robert called me about a proposal. My father's estate could fund a charitable foundation supporting military families, veterans transitioning into civilian life, and families dealing with financial exploitation. My father had spent his life serving others. I didn't want his final legacy to be a number sitting quietly in an account. So, I created the Morgan Family Service Foundation. Part of the inheritance went towards scholarships for children of military families and financial education programs for young service members. One program focused specifically on estate planning, why couples should discuss money honestly, and most importantly, how to recognize financial manipulation. I learned something I wish someone had taught me earlier. Financial abuse doesn't always look like someone stealing your credit card. Sometimes it looks like a loving relative saying, "We're family." Sometimes it sounds like, "If you really loved us, you'd help." And sometimes it arrives wearing a suit and carrying a legal folder. A few months later, Michael and I agreed to attend counseling. During our first session, our counselor asked us a difficult question. "Do you want to save your marriage, or do you simply want to stop feeling guilty about ending it?" Neither of us answered immediately. Finally, I said, "I want to know whether we can build something honest." Michael nodded. "So do I." We spent months learning how to talk about money without fear. We discussed boundaries, family expectations, our careers, and our future. But Michael kept showing up. He never asked me to forget what happened. He never said, "That was my mother, not me." Instead, he said, "I made my own choices." Evelyn never apologized. Eventually, she stopped contacting me directly. One autumn afternoon, almost a year after the day, she first appeared at my door. I drove to Arlington National Cemetery. My father was buried there. I wore my dress uniform. The ceremony was quiet. Leaves moved across the grass in the cold wind. I stood beside his grave for a long time. Then I finally said, "Dad, you were right. The money didn't change people, it revealed them." But as I stood there, I realized something else. My father had taught me how to protect what he left me. Life had taught me something. He couldn't teach me how to decide who deserved another chance. I had spent months thinking revenge meant making Evelyn feel the pain she had caused me. It didn't. The greatest revenge was refusing to become bitter. I simply protected myself, told the truth, and walked away from manipulation. And I gave Michael the chance to prove that he could become a better man. Eventually, we renewed our vows. Before we exchanged rings, Michael looked at me. "I don't deserve another chance because I apologized," he said. "I only deserve it if I spend the rest of my life earning your trust." I smiled. "Then let's start there." When I placed the ring on his finger, I didn't feel like I was erasing the past. That was the real inheritance my father left me, not $68 million. He left me the courage to protect myself, the discipline to wait for the truth, and the wisdom to understand that forgiveness does not require surrender. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, let it be this. Protect what you've worked for, but don't let fear turn your heart into a fortress. Talk openly about money before marriage. Put important agreements in writing. Seek independent legal and financial advice when something feels wrong, and never let anyone convince you that saying no makes you selfish. Sometimes no is how you protect your future. Sometimes no is how you protect your family, and sometimes no is the first honest word you have spoken in years. My father thought he was leaving me $68 million, but in the end, he left me something worth far more. He taught me how to recognize character when money was on the table, and that lesson has stayed with me every day since. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to think about the people in your own life who have stood beside you when there was nothing to gain. If you know someone who needs this reminder about boundaries, trust, or protecting their future, share this story with them. And if you enjoy stories about courage, family, second chances, and finding strength after betrayal, consider subscribing and staying with me for the next story. Thank you for listening. Remember, protect your peace, value your character, and never confuse forgiveness with surrender.